Hey, for the last few weeks, we've been working our way through the book of Colossians, and we're going to wrap that up today. And last week Billy Graham passed away, and we acknowledged him a little bit last week. But I want to kind of go back and look a little bit at some of the stuff that he has, some of the work that he's done, some of the things that have happened, and I'll need my switcher to work. I'm not sure how that connects, but he has literally spoken to more people about Jesus than anyone in the history of Christianity. Like literally more people than anyone in the history of Christianity. And he had his crusades have been big. He's filled up Colosseums with just thousands and thousands and thousands of people. In fact, it's said that thank you guys, it's said that he has spoken to the largest gathering of people in history. No one has had a larger gathering of people than Billy Graham. That's what they say. So when you think about Billy Graham, we think about Billy Graham, but here's the thing about Billy Graham. It wasn't just Billy Graham. It was Billy Graham plus lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people that made this thing work. So the New York Times wrote an article. This was back in 2005. He had a big crusade there, and they wrote an article about this crusade and the preparation that went into it. And so I wanted to read some of this to you. It says, Billy Graham's sermon is a model of simplicity and directness. Is anyone here that you've heard Billy Graham preach? Right? So I remember the first time I heard him preach, I was underwhelmed. I'm like, he's not a great preacher. Did anybody else feel that? That's almost sacrosanct to say that is. Am I like the world's worst person right now? Right, yeah. Ask Davern. That was nice. Yeah. No, I remember. I went to school and I studied preachers, and that's like part of what I had to do. And I'm like, I heard Billy Graham preach. I'm like, he's not really a great preacher. He just kind of gets up there and says a few things, and he's done, right? And God uses him in an extraordinary way. And that's how the New York Times started out their article. They said, Billy Graham's sermon is a model of simplicity and directness. It's not extraordinary. It's not overwhelming. It's just simple and direct, right? And they said, a Billy Graham crusade, like the one that gets underway tomorrow night in Queens, is a decidedly more complex undertaking, requiring, several million painstakingly assembled ingredients, right? So we see Billy Graham, but behind the scenes, there's so much going on, right? For instance, the 5-tier organization chart, essential to helping the throngs of people expected to be in the park, help them find their seats. Or the tactical wall map at the Crusade headquarters, plastered with 1,424 red dots, one for each local church that has worked for months to fill those seats. Or the shelves of binders, pink for women and blue for men, crammed with the applications of 6,000 volunteer counselors who will meet with those who come forward to give their lives to Jesus. They said, when you walk into the facility, into the park, there will be checkpoints, security checkpoints, which are staffed by Cops for Christ. Did you guys even know that was a thing? Yeah, I didn't either until I read this article. Cops for Christ and Christian Law Enforcement Foundation. They said Kent Withington, the Crusade's assistant communications director, said, it's not just to put it on your calendar and show up. The logistics behind this thing are insane. He said even the ineffable must be quantified, or in other words, even the things that we can't necessarily see or put our hands on must be quantified. Preparations for a Billy Graham crusade began months ahead of time with what his organization calls a foundation of prayer. Building this foundation of prayer requires mailing lists and an enormous outreach. We have one group, said Mr. Bailey, that's sending our prayer needs monthly to 35,000 people. It's amazing, right? And then, so when they go into an area, what they want to do is they want to recruit local churches to work with. And so when they went into New York City, they tried to contact every church within a 50-mile radius of New York City, and there was no list of churches. So Billy Graham Crusade got together, and they put one together, and they said, we now have 12,000 churches on this list. They reached out to all 12,000 churches, of which 1,400 agreed to participate. That's kind of interesting, huh? Now, here's what's really crazy. By the way, that was the highest number of congregations in the history of Billy Graham's crusades, right? The highest number of participating churches. They said there are 80 denominations represented, from Adventists to the Vineyard, Mennonite, and Messianic and Hebrew Pentecostal. I didn't even know that was a thing. Hebrew Pentecostal, right? But they're all participating in this Billy Graham. Pastors and members of the churches attended 43 seminars on every aspect of the crusade. This crusade cost in total about $6.8 million. One local pastor talked about all of the loads and loads of crusade flyers which would be handed out in the neighborhood. And in return, then, what would happen is when the churches would partner with Billy Graham, he would preach, people would come and say, I want to give my life to Christ. They would then connect them to all these local churches throughout the area. The crusade had 30 paid staff to oversee this campaign of thousands and thousands of volunteers. Then they had organizers who were booking the Christian bands that would play there. And they also, this was interesting, they secured the services of Bible Man, a caped crusader in spandex and silver body armor who will lead the children's rally on Saturday morning at Flushing Meadows. Sounds like Jack Black. What's that guy? What's that? Nacho Libre, right. Nacho Libre for Jesus. And then, of course, they're interviewing and looking at all 6,000 volunteers. They're going to participate in this. Here's an interesting line. They were asked, what did Jesus do for sinners? And one application form said, he went to the cross to die for our sins, wrote one successful applicant who was the leader of a children's wrestling ministry in Old Bridge, New Jersey. Children's wrestling ministry. Interesting, all right? They go on and on. On Monday, the great unloading begins at the park. The crusade sprawls across 93 acres. More than 70,000 chairs are being put in place. The mobile kitchen is going up. So is the booth where Mr. Graham's sermons will be translated into 13 languages, including Tamil, Hungarian, and Arabic. From start to finish, the service will be over an hour and a half. There's choir, there's music, and he said, Mr. Graham said, I'd like to leave them a bit, hoping for a bit more. And the more that they leave them hoping for is the final commitment to Jesus Christ. And they said at this point, 2005, at this point, 3.2 million people have pledged their lives to Christ at the Graham Crusades. It's crazy. So I look at this and I'm like, you know, you hear Billy Graham and you think, Billy Graham, he's got his museum here in Charlotte, and but without the thousands and thousands of volunteers, without the hundreds and hundreds of local churches, without the people doing the music, without the people doing the lights, and all of their stories, Billy Graham crusades don't happen. It takes everybody. And so as I'm reading through here, I read the stories of the people who help, and I think about the men and the women and all of the diversity of people who helped make this thing work. I keep thinking about this one idea. God's work always takes a diverse bunch. God's work will always take a diverse bunch. Now, here at Church 180, one of the things we say is that things are going to be changing all the time. Like, just you can expect that there's always going to be change happening. But we've identified 7 things that will never change at our church, and we call those the hills we'll die on. These are battles that we'll fight. One of those hills that we said we will die on is that we believe the church ought to be diverse. We believe that Sunday ought to look like Monday. Here's what I mean by that. When I come to church on Sunday, it shouldn't be much different than my experience on Monday in the workplace or in the grocery store or in my neighborhood. If everybody in my church looks like me, thinks like me, acts like me, believes like me, then we're missing some of God's best ideas. Our workplaces don't look like that. Our schools don't look like that. Our neighborhoods don't look like that. God's work always takes a diverse bunch. And now, we say, again, we want to be a church where Sunday looks like Monday, and we don't say that because it's kind of cool to say that. We don't say it because it's politically correct. We don't say it for that reason. We say it because the scriptures teach, and I'm going to show you this morning, that God's work always takes a diverse bunch. It's kind of like this. If you take a potato by itself, there's only so many things you can do with that potato, right? You can boil it, you can bake it, you can chop it into little pieces, you can eat it whole, You can peel it and put it in a potato gun, right? There's only so much stuff you can do with a potato, but if you add some carrots and some celery and some meat and some salt and some garlic and some broth, you've created a beef stew. The best things always require diversity, right? Now, it's always worked this way. It was this way with Billy Graham, and it also was this way with St. Paul, the guy who has written this letter that we've been looking at for the last few weeks. Actually, it's been 8 weeks that we've been working this letter, our way through a letter that St. Paul wrote to a group of Christians in a city called Colossae. It's in our Bible. It's called Colossians. And these were rookie Christians. They just had no clue how to live the Christian life. They'd never really heard about Jesus. So St. Paul is introducing Jesus to them. He's saying, this is who Jesus is. This is how he works. This is what he did for us through his death on the cross and his resurrection. This is how Jesus will change your life. It's how he'll impact your relationships. And that's what the whole book of Colossians is all about. And so today, as he wraps up his letter, I can't wait for you to see how he does it. So here we go. It's in Colossians chapter 4, verse 17. This is what he says. He's wrapping up his letter, and he says this. Tychicus will give you a full report about how I'm getting along. He is a beloved brother and faithful helper who serves with me in the Lord's work. And so what I'm going to do this morning is I just want to read through this list that Paul gives, and I'll make some commentary along the way, and then we're done with that. I'll make a point. Usually, when you get to the end of a Bible book, that's the boring part, isn't it? Right? Like you get to this long list of names you can't pronounce, and you're like, well, God will understand if I just skip this or cruise over it really fast, right? But there's so much goodness in here, and so I just want to read this. So this guy, Tychicus, Paul said he's traveled with me, and he's a messenger for me. Remember, Paul, when he was writing this, was sitting in a prison because he had been talking about Jesus. In those days, you didn't do that. So Paul's in prison for his faith. He said, I'm going to let Tychicus come to you. He's going to tell you about myself. He's going to tell you how we're doing. He's a beloved brother. He's a faithful helper. If you read through the New Testament, you'll see that this guy Tychicus is actually mentioned 5 times. So he'd been around a little bit. And then Paul said, I've sent him to you for this very purpose, to let you know how we're doing and to encourage you. And that's kind of cool. Paul's like, a lot of times think about this. I'm in prison. Maybe you should send somebody to encourage me. Right? Paul's like, no, I'm in prison, but I know God's doing something, and I'm going to send my buddy Tychicus to you, and he's going to tell you what's going on, and he's going to encourage you. That's kind of cool. He said, I'm also sending Onesimus, a faithful and a beloved brother, one of your own people. He and Tychicus will tell you everything that's happened here. Has anyone heard of the name Onesimus before? You know who that is? Anybody know who that is? So Paul, while he was in prison, wrote another letter that happens to be in our Bible called Philemon. And the letter of Philemon was actually written to a guy named... No, sorry. I totally set that up wrong. The letter of Philemon was written to a guy named Philemon, right? And Philemon was a rich man who lived in Colossae. And Paul said, hey, Philemon, you once had a slave. His name was Onesimus. And Onesimus ran away, and he escaped. And you've been looking for him, and guess what? I found him. And he's become a friend, and he's become a brother, and he's become a very important part of my life and the thing that God is doing here. Philemon, he's coming back to you. Will you treat him like a brother? Will you treat him like a man of God? Will you give him respect? So this is Onesimus. So when you read the name Onesimus, think escaped slave. Paul says nothing about that in this letter. He just says he's a faithful and beloved brother. He's one of your own people. He and Tychicus will tell you everything that's happening here. Some scholars actually think that Onesimus went on to be the pastor of a church at Ephesus, right? That we have in the book of our Bible, a book in our Bible called Ephesians. And then Paul says, and then there's Aristarchus, who's in prison with me. He sends you his greetings, and so does Mark, Barnabas' cousin. As you were instructed before, make Mark welcome if he comes your way. So this guy Aristarchus, you read through the New Testament and you find a couple times he was in prison with Paul, right? Right now he's in prison. He had traveled with Paul a lot. One time they were in the city of Ephesus and they're talking about Jesus and he got beat up. Aristarchus got beat up for what he was talking about, right? So he'd been around the block with Paul. And then there's Mark, who would go on to write a biography of Jesus. It's in our Bible. It's called Mark, the Gospel of Mark. He'd worked with St. Peter. He'd worked with St. Paul. Early in his ministry, he had actually got overwhelmed by the pressure of ministry and bailed. He's like, this is too much. I'm done. I'm out of here. Made Paul pretty mad at him. But over the course of time, Paul said, is this John Mark, he got courage again and re-engaged in ministry and allowed Jesus to work through him. He became someone useful for the kingdom of God. And Paul said, listen, when Mark comes to you, I want you to make him welcome because he's an important player on the team. And then Paul said, hey, there's another guy here. His name is Jesus. We call him Justice. So not like Jesus the Lord, just another guy like maybe Jesus, right? All right. He sends his greetings. Who is this guy who's Justice? No one knows. He's never been mentioned before. We have no idea who he is. But then Paul says, these are the only Jewish believers among my coworkers. They're working with me here for the kingdom of God, and what a comfort they've been. So let me just tell you what's happening here. There's some racial diversity in Paul's team. The fact that he says, hey, I'm here in prison. I'm in Rome. And there's only a handful of Jews. Everyone else is a Roman or some other nationality. But there's a handful of Jews that are part of my team. So there's racial diversity on this team. Then he goes on, by the way, listen, if you don't have any kids and you're looking for some names for kids, this is a great place to start. Like Tychicus, you can't go wrong with that, all right? So then Paul said, look, there's a guy here named Epaphras. He's a member of your own fellowship. And he's a servant of Christ, and he sends you his greetings. If you read through the book of Colossians, you'll see in the very first part of Colossians that Epaphras was a local boy. He probably started the local church at Colossae there in Colossians 1:7. He had traveled with Paul. He's now in prison with him, but Paul says, while he's in prison, look what he's doing. He always prays earnestly for you, asking God to make you strong and perfect, fully confident that you're following the whole will of God. I can assure you that he prays hard for you and also for the believers in Laodicea and Hierapolis, which are surrounding communities. So this guy's in prison, but he's not, woe is me. He's not whining. He's not puttering around. He's actually praying for you. And then there's Luke. Paul says, this is Luke, the beloved doctor. He sends his greeting, and so does Demas. Remember, all these people, they're not, like Luke and Demas, they're not necessarily in prison, but they're hanging out around there so they can visit Paul and encourage him, right? Luke had traveled with Paul a lot. He actually was a published author. He published a biography of Jesus. It's in our Bible called the Gospel of Luke. He published the first history of the church, which is in our Bible called the book of Acts. And he was a world traveler. He was also a doctor. And then you've got this guy named Demas. He traveled with Paul, and ultimately, if you read in 2 Timothy chapter 4, you'll find out that he ended up bailing on Paul. Paul said, look, Demas has left me. He loves the world more than he loves what we're doing here, so he's gone. But he was a part of this group. Paul said, please give my greetings to our brothers and sisters in Laodicea and to Nympha and the church that meets at her house. So again, who's Nympha? Don't know, right? Probably this isn't the ancient Greek word means this is a bride or a young woman. So, I mean, maybe her name was Nympha. Maybe it's just another way of saying, bring greetings to that young lady who's doing the work of God. And there's a church meeting in her house. She's a church planner. Bring greeting to her. And then he said, after you've read this letter, pass it on to the church at Laodicea so they can read it too. You should read the letter I wrote to them. And then say to Archippus, be sure to carry out the ministry the Lord gave you. So Archippus, scholars think, is probably a local ministry leader, maybe a little discouraged, and just needed a high five, a word of encouragement, right? And then Paul wraps it up. He says this, here's my greeting in my own handwriting, Paul. Remember my chains. May God's grace be with you. Now, that was kind of boring a little bit, right? Reading through all those names and all that stuff. And sometimes we miss the amazing things that God has tucked away because sometimes we've got to dig a little bit. So let's dig a little bit. As we read through those names, what occurred to you? Maybe I've primed the pump a little bit, but as we read through this list of names, what kinds of things occurred to you? What did you think? Okay. Well, to me, as I read through these lists, tough crowd. Y'all are so mad about the Davern thing. So the one word that pops out, or the most obvious thing that pops out is they don't really have a lot in common. So I guess the one word that I would use to summarize these people is diversity, right? So there's gender diversity. You got a bunch of guys, and then you've got this girl who's planning a church in her house. Paul said we're all on the same team, though. You've got economic diversity. You've got Luke, who's a doctor, He's a published author. He's a world traveler. And you've got Onesimus, who's an escaped slave. You've got racial diversity. There's a bunch of Jews working with Colossians and Romans, and there's racial diversity. You've got people in this group who have a high tolerance for adventure. And then you've got people who are traveling around the world, some people who are putting their life on the line, people who would end up in prison because they got caught teaching about Jesus. And then you've just got homebodies. People are like, I'm all about Jesus, but I want to stay in my home. You've got different personalities. You've got this Epaphras who's all about praying. Man, I'm in prison, but man, I can't stop praying for you. I'm thinking about you, and I'm worried about you, and I'm praying strong prayers for you. And then you've got this guy Archippus who's kind of discouraged. He's a leader in a local ministry setting, and he just needs some encouragement. He doesn't have as hearty of a personality, perhaps, as Epaphras. You've got a diversity of experiences. You've got authors and doctors, slaves, pastors. You've got people who would go on to be famous like Luke, and people who are absolutely unknown like Justus. And it reminds me again that God's work always takes a diverse bunch. I look around our church, and I realize that what God is doing in our church is absolutely built not on the shoulders of one person, but is built on the shoulders of a diverse bunch. Stacy Jones, right? If you don't know Stacy, you're missing out on something beautiful. If you know him for long at all, he's undoubtedly threatened to punch you in the throat. But I want to tell you something. I tell Stacy and Jill this all the time. I wish every pastor had a Stacy and Jill Jones in their life. Amazing people. And then you got Casey Brown. Casey Brown, watching this man evolve into this man of God, and he stands up here and leads us in worship every morning. It's awesome to watch him and as he parents his children. And then we've got Fran Henson, who stood up here this morning, and Dog Tater. And then there's Tater. We've got Terry Ockenfels. We've got Alex Simons. We've got Dallas Peterson. Randy and Angie Hoover serving next door. Davern and Kim Kirk. I actually wrote your name down, dude. I got it, right? Right. Thank the Lord. And I look at this group of people, and I'm like, man, not only is there diversity in skin color, but there's diversity in age, and there's diversity in background, and there's diversity in story. And some people have really jacked their lives up, and other people have never even thought a bad word. And yet somehow God works in this diverse group of people to make something absolutely extraordinary. Now, God's best work will always include diversity. So let me just tell you this again, and I can't beat this drum enough. If your church is filled with people who look like you and think like you and act like you and believe like you, you're going to miss God's best stuff. There should absolutely be diversity. It worked for Billy Graham. It worked for St. Paul. Even Jesus built a diverse group of people with whom and through whom to work. Now, here's the key. In all of that diversity, there is a bit of unity. And that is this. For all of these people and all of their diverse backgrounds and nationalities and economic status, and probably some had tattoos and others didn't have tattoos, and maybe some read a ton and others didn't read so much, and some had huge bank accounts and others never wrote a check. I mean, who knows? But all of these diversities, there was this in common. And that is Jesus and the gospel were not recreational part-time interest. It consumed them. For some, being consumed with Jesus meant, I'm going to leave my comfort zone and I'm going to go do ministry traveling around the world. For others, it meant, I'm going to stay right here in Colossae and I'm going to do the work that God calls me to do right here. But all of them had this in common. It was front and center on the stage of their life. The call of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, it absolutely changed their plans. It rearranged their priorities. It made them reevaluate their finances. And it aligned them with unlikely teammates. And let me just tell you this. When Jesus grabs a hold of your heart, when he absolutely sinks his fingers into your heart, listen, he will begin to align and rearrange and help you to rethink what's important in your life. For some of these people, they said the most important thing is my life. And in my life, it's not my freedom. It's not my personal economy. It's not even relationships. The most important thing in my life is discovering and executing the will of God in my life. And that's what connecting with Jesus on a fundamental level will do. Now, it will put you in places and on teams with people that you aren't always comfortable with, that you can't always identify with. But as the body of Christ, as we grow more and more like Jesus, we become comfortable with people who don't look like us or act like us or think like us or maybe even believe like us. Their stories will be different, but we're okay with that because we're all working together for Jesus. Now, every generation is going to produce men and women who are willing to sacrifice to do the work of God. Every person that we've read here today in this list is dead. They're dead. Billy Graham, dead. Fitz and I I don't know if it's a joke or not, but occasionally we'll look at each other and say, you're going to die soon, someday. Maybe not soon, but someday, right? And the idea here is this. If all Fitz does is lead worship in this environment and then dies, it's done. If all I do is preach in this environment and then die, it's done. The best thing we can do is invest in another generation and the next generation that's coming up behind us so that when Fitz retires and moves to a beachfront condo and props his feet, is that happening? No? So whatever happens to Fitz or whatever happens to me or whatever happens to you, there's another generation coming on. Now let me just talk fairly straightforward. I keep thinking about this. And that is, someday, probably fairly soon, my generation, our generation, we're going to be the old ones in the church. Can I get a witness? Is that good news? Right? We're going to be the old people in the church. And my question is, the question I continue to wrestle is, what will our children think about the church that we've built? What will our children think about Christianity as we've modeled it? Because I know, as growing up as a young person, like you begin to form your ideas of God and you begin to form your ideas of the church and you begin to form your ideas of Christianity based on the older people who are living it out in front of you. And we have this incredible responsibility as elders in the church to live well the gospel of Jesus. And let's just be honest, if we're not careful, a lot of time we can live in such a way that Christianity is conformed to our comfort rather than conforming our comfort to the calls of the Christianity. Jesus has called us to live a life, and that life will require a realigning of our priorities. It will require us reconsidering how we engage our finances. It will require us rethinking how we engage our interests, what we do with our interests, where we pay attention to, how we invest our time. He really wants everything in our life, not just Sunday morning at 10. Thank you for Sunday morning at 10, but he wants 24/7. My kids say 24/8. Have you guys heard that? Right, 8 days a week. I guess they're thinking that there's something more than 24/7. But that's what Jesus wants. That's what these people gave. That's what Billy Graham's team and all those people gave, was an absolute wide open commitment with no holds barred. And so when I think about, like, what are our kids going to see when they think about church, when they think about Christians, and my prayer is that they will see a diversified group of people unified around the idea of working for Jesus in this world. The most important thing is that we stand shoulder to shoulder working for Jesus in this world, making sacrifices, giving, serving, loving, forgiving, believing that God can do extraordinary things in our generation too. I do not want to be a part of a church, and I don't want to be a part of a group of Christians where Christianity is something that happens on Sunday morning and that's it. It wasn't for these people. It consumed their lives. It took them around the world. For some of them, it meant prison. For others, it meant death. For others, it meant a complete realignment of all their priorities. And that's what it will take if we're going to see God actually do something extraordinary in our generation, a rethinking of how we do life, a rethinking of where we spend our attention, honestly, this is a really big deal. I look at the group of people that Paul talked about. These are my teammates. These are the people that we're doing the work with. And they were part of a young movement that spread rapidly throughout Asia and beyond, and today is a worldwide phenomenon because a handful of people radically committed to Jesus, wide open acceptance to this idea that this team is going to be diverse. There's going to be all kinds of different people and experiences and giftings and passions and talents. And that's where God does his best work. Now, I look at what's happening now in our church, and I see that God is doing something in our church that feels like there's a bubbling, a rippling. And we've told you some of these things, but as we look ahead, some things that we're looking at, some things that we're working on and preparing for and planning for will include. We're asking God to bring on another pastor to help in the spiritual care and the spiritual oversight and the spiritual leadership of our church, to care well for our church. At some point, our church will move. Like, this is not going to be here forever. We've got people right now in our church who are actually writing songs, and we're soon going to be introducing them in a worship environment, but they're writing songs. God is using them. We have world care opportunities ranging from Lumberton in North Carolina. We have them locally, The Haven, Evanport Elementary. We've been commissioned, we've talked about this in the past, but we've been commissioned as a church to start other churches. So there's all kinds of things that God has called us to do. But I want to tell you something. It's absolutely going to require a diverse team of people working together, sacrificing, fully committed to what Jesus wants to do. Through our church, through the larger church, that's what it takes. Now, here's what we know. What God is calling us to do, what God is calling you to do, will require all of us, a diverse group, unified in purpose, to help other people discover God. I think the coolest thing is when people who walk into the church for the first time, who are discouraged, disheartened, broken, marriage is in trouble, and they discover God. That's what it's all about, because that's a game changer, isn't it? That's a big deal. But it takes all of us working together. Connecting with friends. Hey, listen, it's awesome to have a relationship with Jesus, but even if you read through scriptures, one of the first things that Jesus did was he connected people to other people, because you can't do the Christian life alone. It takes connection. And the church is a place where that begins to happen. And then ultimately it's a place where we learn to make better choices and learn to do life well, like Jesus would. The truth is, we need each other to get this done. We need each other to get this done.